Good evening, dear listener. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you can let this time be simple, nothing to solve, nothing to prove, nowhere else you need to be. If it feels right, allow your shoulders to loosen, your jaw to soften, and your breathing to slow, as though the night itself is doing the work for you. You don't have to hold the day up anymore. Tonight, you can rest in a place that is warm and safe, with steady walls and gentle light, while the weather spends its energy far away. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the story carry you, like a quiet tide that knows exactly where to go. The road to the lighthouse was a thin ribbon of dark that shone in places where rain had gathered, reflecting the faintest smear of sky. Late autumn had stripped the land down to its honest shapes, stone, grass, and the patient twist of shrubs that held on close to the ground. The wind moved in wide, invisible hands, pushing at hedges and tugging at the hem of the world. But it couldn't quite break anything that mattered. By the time the house beside the lighthouse came into view, the rain had become steadier, as if it had settled into its own routine. The lighthouse stood tall and pale against the night, and every so often the beams swept across the sea and the wet fields behind it. A slow, deliberate glance. There was comfort in that rhythm, in the certainty that something kept watch even when most windows were dark. The house itself looked smaller than the tower, but it looked kinder too, lower, thicker, with a roof that had learned how to carry wind without complaining. A warm rectangle of light waited in one downstairs window, and the sight of it felt like being recognized. The path leading to the door was slick and uneven, and each step made a soft sound that vanished under the weather. When you reached the stone threshold, the scent rose up to meet you, wet rock and salt, a mineral smell that was clean and grounding. Rain had darkened the stones until they seemed almost black, and the mortar between them held tiny beads of water like quiet pearls. For a moment, you paused there, letting the smell mark the boundary between outside and inside, between the wild air and the shelter you were about to enter. The key turned with an old-fashioned resistance, the kind that suggests the lock is doing its job seriously. The door opened on a hinge that gave a soft groan, not a complaint, but an announcement, and warm air slipped out like a welcoming hand. You stepped in, pulled the door closed, and the sound of the storm softened instantly, as if the house had lowered a curtain between you and the night. Inside, everything was dim and gentle. A small lamp glowed in the corner, its light honey-colored, and the shadows it made were rounded rather than sharp. The entryway held coats and boots in an orderly line, and beneath your feet the floorboards felt steady and dry, their faint creak familiar in a way that calmed the mind. You stood still for a few breaths, listening. The wind still made itself known. There was a low rush against the walls, and now and then a hard patter of rain against the window panes. But the sound reached you muffled, filtered through thick stone and careful construction, turned from something urgent into something distant and almost soothing. A kettle waited on the stove in the kitchen, and even the shape of it suggested comfort. Round, solid, with a handle that had been held 1,000 times. You set your bag down, hung your coat, and walked to the stove without hurrying. This was a place where nothing needed to be rushed, where the night could unfold slowly and your body could follow. The kitchen was simple in the best way. There were open shelves with stacked mugs, a tin for tea, a jar for cocoa powder, and a small bowl of sugar. A wooden table sat near the window, and on it a folded blanket lay ready, as if someone had anticipated your arrival and left a soft answer to the cold. You filled the kettle and set it on the heat, then turned to the hearth, where a small fire still held warmth in its coals. Someone, perhaps the last keeper on duty, perhaps you earlier in the day, had banked it carefully. You added a couple of logs, arranged them with an unhurried hand, and watched as the flames found their way back, brightening from a sleepy orange to a steady, living glow. As the fire woke up, so did the room. Light changed the kitchen's edges, warmed the color of the wood, and made the window look less like a barrier and more like a framed view. The rain outside took on a silvery texture, and in the distance, through the glass, you could see the lighthouse beams sweep and vanish, like a patient thought returning again and again to the same reassuring point. The kettle began to murmur, that first sound of water thinking about boiling. You opened the tin of cocoa, and a familiar chocolate scent rose up, rich and slightly sweet, with a hint of something deeper that always felt like memory. You chose a mug that fit your hands well, thick ceramic, a little heavier than it needed to be, which made it feel dependable. While the water heated, you moved through small tasks that were both practical and calming. You wiped the counter where a few droplets had splashed, then lined the mugs on the shelf so their handles faced the same way. Each motion was quiet, as though you were telling your nervous system that there was nothing here to prepare for except rest. On a hook near the back door hung an old cloth and a small tin of polish. The brass fittings around the house, handles, lamp bases, a narrow rail near the stairs were kept in good condition, not for vanity, but out of care. Brass responded to attention. It brightened when you treated it gently, and the brightening felt like a conversation between your hands and the house. You took down a brass lantern from a shelf, the kind used in case the electricity ever failed. Its surface was dulled in places where fingers had touched it often, and the metal held the faintest chill, even indoors. You dabbed a little polish onto the cloth and began to rub in slow circles, watching as the brass shifted from muted to softly shining. The motion was satisfying. Pressure, warmth, release. The smell of the polish mixed with the fire's woody scent and the clean mineral trace that had followed you in from the doorway. Outside, the wind hit the house harder for a moment, and the window pane vibrated faintly. But your hands did not change their pace. When the kettle finally reached a gentle boil, it did not shriek. It simply announced itself with a steady, friendly sound. You poured the water into the mug where cocoa waited, stirring slowly until the powder dissolved into something smooth and dark. A small cloud of chocolate steam rose up, and you leaned in just enough to let the warmth touch your face. You added a little milk, watched the color lighten to a softer brown, then stirred again until the surface shone. The first sip was careful and quiet. It tasted like warmth made drinkable, like a pause you could hold in your mouth before it traveled down into your chest. With the cocoa in hand, you carried the lantern to the sitting room. The room had a sofa with worn arms, a bookshelf full of salt-stained novels and weather guides, and a low chair positioned near the window, as if someone had once liked to watch storms from safety. A woven rug covered most of the floor, and on the sofa, a thick plaid blanket waited, folded into a neat square. You sat down and unfolded the blanket, letting it drape across your lap and over your legs. The fabric was heavy enough to feel protective, and as it settled, warmth began to gather underneath it, the kind that spreads slowly and stays. You took another sip of cocoa and let your shoulders drop, as if the blanket had permission to hold them too. From here, you could hear the sea, but it was not close enough to demand your attention. It came to you as a low, continuous presence behind the storm, a distant, steady breathing that made the world feel larger and more settled. The lighthouse beam passed across the window again, and for a second the room brightened in a pale sweep, then returned to its cozy glow. You were not rushing tonight, not even in your thoughts. You were the keeper here, whether official or temporary, whether by job or by choice, and the role did not ask for strain. It asked for steadiness, for the kind of confidence that comes from doing small things well and trusting the walls to do what they were built to do. Still, there was one more task that belonged to the night: the lamp. The lighthouse lamp did not light itself, not in the way old stories pretend. It needed a human presence, a check, a hand that cared enough to confirm everything was ready. It needed someone calm enough to climb stairs without resentment, and to look at the sea without needing it to be gentle. You finished your cocoa slowly, then set the mug on a coaster and stood. The blanket tried to keep you, just a little, but you patted it as if to promise you'd be back. In the hallway, you took a small flashlight and a set of keys, though you knew most doors here by feel. The stairs to the lighthouse tower were separate from the house, accessed through a sheltered passage with thick stone walls. You crossed the short corridor where the air was cooler and smelled more strongly of damp rock. Even here, even in the place closest to the storm, the house's warmth followed you like a trailing ribbon. At the tower door, you paused again and listened. The wind made a deeper sound here, a long exhale through the tower's outer seams. Rain tapped at the stone as if testing it. The ocean's distant voice was steady underneath, unchanged. The door opened into the tower's interior, and the air shifted cooler, cleaner, tinged with metal and old oil. The spiral staircase rose in a tight curve, each step worn smooth. You began to climb, one hand on the rail, your movements practiced and unhurried. As you went up, the sound of the storm changed. It became both farther away and more present, depending on the angle, like a song heard from another room. Occasionally, a narrow slit window offered a glimpse of darkness and spray, and each glimpse reminded you that the world outside was doing its own fierce work, while you moved through your own calm routine. At the top, the lamp room greeted you with its familiar shapes: the large lens assembly, the housing, the instruments that measured and regulated. The main light was already functioning, rotating with a steady hum, but you performed your checks anyway, because that was what steadiness meant. You inspected the oil reserves and the mechanisms. You checked the backup, and you made sure there was no unusual vibration. Then you did something that always felt ceremonial, no matter how many times you'd done it. You cleaned a small section of brass near the base of the lens, polishing it until it caught the light and returned it in a soft glow. The act was not necessary for survival, not strictly, but it was necessary for care, and care mattered in places like this. You stood by the window for a moment and watched the beams sweep over the sea. Somewhere out there, beyond what you could see, waves rose and fell in cold darkness. The storm made white patterns that appeared and vanished, and the wind pulled at the surface as though trying to rearrange it. And yet, nothing about it frightened you. You respected it, the way you respect a large animal or a powerful engine, by keeping your distance, by understanding its nature, by not pretending it should be something else. You were sheltered, and because you were sheltered, you could look without fear. After a final glance around the lamp room, you turned back toward the stairs. Descending felt even easier, as if gravity itself wanted you to return to warmth. The tower's air became less sharp with each step, and when you reached the passage back to the house, the scent of wet stone met you again, earthy, salty, clean. You closed the tower door and walked the corridor with quiet certainty. Your boots made a soft sound on the floor. The house waited ahead, unchanged, holding its lamplit rooms and its patient warmth. When you stepped back inside, the fire had settled into a steady burn, and the kitchen looked like a small island of gold against the night. You took your mug to the sink, rinsed it, and left it to dry. Then, as if on instinct, you checked the latch on the back door and the window locks, not because you expected trouble, but because the ritual itself was a form of comfort. In the sitting room, you reclaimed the blanket. You sat on the sofa and let the plaid fabric cover you again, and immediately your body recognized the return to stillness. You turned off the overhead light and left only the small lamp on, the one that made the corners gentle. The storm outside seemed to increase for a while. Wind pushed harder, rain thickened, and the house responded with small, familiar noises. A soft creak in a beam, a faint rattle in the window frame that would stop when the wind shifted direction. None of these sounds felt alarming. They were the house speaking its own language, reporting the weather without panic. You leaned back and listened for the sea again. There it was, distant but constant, like a long breath drawn through the dark. Sometimes the wind would mask it. Sometimes it would return clearly. And each time it returned, it reminded you that there are rhythms bigger than any one night. On the shelf near the sofa sat a radio, old but reliable. You turned it on low, just enough to hear the soft hiss between stations, and for a moment you considered searching for a weather report. But you already knew what you needed to know. The storm was here, and you were safe inside it. Instead, you left the radio on its quiet hush and let it blend with the fire. You watched the flames slow dance and felt the blanket grow warmer where it touched you. The warmth was not only heat, it was reassurance, a gentle pressure telling your muscles they could unclench. Your eyes moved to the window. The glass held tiny streams of water that slid downward, merging and separating like slow, shining threads. Occasionally, the lighthouse beam would pass over the yard, illuminating the rain for a brief second, turning every droplet into a silver pinprick. Then it would move on, and the darkness would soften again. You found yourself thinking of how many nights this house had held, how many storms had thrown themselves against these walls, and how many times someone had sat exactly where you sat, listening to weather while staying warm. It it did not feel lonely. It felt like belonging to a chain of quiet evenings, each one linked by the same small acts of care. After a while, you stood and stretched, not because you were restless, but because your body asked for a gentle shift. You walked to the bookshelf and traced a finger along the spines, feeling the slight grit of salt that seemed to collect in all seaside places. You chose a book you'd read before, something familiar enough that it wouldn't pull you into alertness. You sat back down and opened it, letting the pages fall where they wanted. The words were steady and plain, like footsteps on a path. Every few paragraphs you paused to listen again to the fire, to the storm, to the far-off sea. At some point, the wind changed. You could tell not by sight, but by the way the house's sounds rearranged themselves. The rattle in the window ceased, replaced by a softer rush along the east wall. The rain became a little lighter, more like a steady tapping than a heavy drumming. You did not need to interpret it further. Weather had its own mind. Your role was simply to stay warm, stay present, and keep the light moving out over the water. A small clock on the mantel ticked in a slow, confident way. Its sound was not sharp. It was thick and soft, as if time itself had decided to walk quietly. You let the ticking become part of your breathing, part of the room's gentle pulse. Your thoughts began to slow, not from exhaustion, but from comfort. When the mind feels safe, it stops scanning the horizon. It stops replaying and rehearsing. It drifts naturally toward quieter shores. You set the book down and went to the kitchen to make one more small cup of cocoa, a half portion this time. The kettle, still warm, came back to a simmer quickly. You stirred the cocoa and watched the surface turn glossy, then carried it back with both hands, feeling the mug's heat seep into your palms. Back on the sofa, you pulled the blanket higher, tucking it around your shoulders like a shawl. The air near the fire was warm, but beyond the room's center, it remained cool enough to make the warmth feel meaningful. You took slow sips, each one a soft punctuation mark in the quiet. Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its steady sweep. It did not rush. It did not falter. It simply did what it was meant to do, again and again. was something deeply soothing in that kind of purpose. You thought briefly of any ships out there, of distant crews hearing the storm and trusting the light. You imagined them seeing that beam cut through rain and feeling their own shoulders loosen the way yours had. The idea made you feel connected, not responsible in a heavy way, but connected in a gentle one, like sharing a small kindness across a dark distance. The storm's louder moments came and went. Sometimes a gust would hit hard enough to make the chimney sing, a low note that rose and fell. Sometimes rain would slap the side of the house, then soften to a whisper. Through it all, the interior remained steady. Firelight, lamplight, the soft weight of fabric, the quiet scent of cocoa and wood. You realized your eyelids were growing heavier, not suddenly, but gradually, like curtains lowering. You let them close for a few seconds, then opened them again, just to see the room once more. Everything was in place. Everything was safe. Still, you didn't go to bed yet. You had one more small ritual, one that always marked the night as complete. You stood, folded the blanket neatly, though not too neatly, just enough to show care, and placed it back on the sofa. Then you picked up the cloth again and gave the brass lantern one final pass, polishing the last dull spot near the handle. The lantern caught the lamplight and held it. The brass looked like a quiet promise, warm and steady. You set it back on the shelf, and for a moment you simply looked at it, satisfied not because it was perfect, but because it was tended. In the entryway, your boots had dried a little, leaving faint marks on the mat. The house smelled faintly of wet stone still, but now it was only a trace, the outside world reduced to a memory at the edge of your senses. You liked that contrast, the knowledge of weather without the burden of it. You moved through the rooms, turning lights down one by one. The kitchen lamp remained on low. The sitting room lamp dimmed to a soft amber. The hallway light became a guiding glow rather than a bright statement. Each change was slow and deliberate, and with each one, the house seemed to settle deeper into night. Upstairs, your bedroom was small and plain, with a bed that looked inviting in its simplicity. The window there was smaller, set deep into the wall, and the sound of the storm was even more distant. You could still hear it, but it had become a lullaby made of wind and rain rather than a force. You changed into warm clothes and slipped into bed. The sheets were cool at first, then quickly warmed as your body heat spread. You pulled the duvet up and felt it settle over you like another kind of blanket, lighter than the plaid downstairs, but just as reassuring. Before turning off the bedside lamp, you looked at the room one last time. The walls were thick. The door was closed. The air smelled clean, with the faintest hint of wood smoke drifting up from below. Everything you needed was here, and everything that could wait until morning was allowed to wait. You clicked the lamp off, and darkness filled the room, but it was not empty darkness. It was a dark with shape and safety, a dark that belonged to sleep. Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its slow turning, sending light out into the storm without asking anything from you now. Lying there, you listened one more time for the sea. It was faint, but it was there, steady as a distant drum. Wind rose and fell. Rain tapped and softened. The house held firm, warm around you. Your breathing slowed. Your thoughts, which had been gentle already, grew even softer, loosening their grip and drifting away like mist. The storm stayed outside where it belonged, and inside, in the calm heart of the lighthouse house, you let yourself sink into rest, safe